Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar hosted by ISC Research in collaboration with BSME, the Association of British Schools in the Middle East. My name is Will Bedford, Senior Manager of the Schools Division here at ISC, and I will be your host for the webinar today. To offer a brief introduction to those who don't know, ISC Research has been tracking the world's international schools market for the past 25 years. We gather and supply market intelligence, data and analysis to support international schools in many aspects of business strategy and development, and to support education specialists and organisations in resourcing and assisting the schools. For the last few months, most of our work has been related to the impact of coronavirus, and our field researchers who are based around the world are monitoring market changes as best they can. They're talking with school heads when it's possible, and building a big picture of the impact that coronavirus is having on international schools right now, and how it will likely impact schools and suppliers in the longer term. We've heard some exceptional stories of resilience and adaptability by some international schools, and many examples of the sharing of resources and good practice. We hope this webinar today will continue the sharing of solutions and effective practice. And without further ado, please allow me to introduce you to our guest speakers. Mark Leppard, MBE, is headmaster of the British School of Al Khabairat in the UAE, and Mark is the current chair of BSME. Nicola Singleton is based in Egypt. She's principal of the Modern English School Cairo, and Nicola is the current vice chair of BSME. And Sam Fraser is the head of field research at ISC Research. Sam is currently based in Singapore and leads our team of field-based researchers who are located around the world, mostly throughout Asia. Welcome to you all, and many thanks for joining us today. We have well over 1,000 people participating in today's webinar, so thanks to you all for joining us. Please do post your questions throughout this session. We won't have time today to respond directly, but we will respond to as many questions as we can, either directly or through a blog very soon following the webinar. Okay, so let's kick things off by looking at school closures in the Middle East. Let's begin with you, please, Nicola. Your school is in Egypt, and in your role as Vice Chair of BSME, you engage closely with many international schools in the Middle East and North Africa regions. Can you provide an overview of the impact campus closures have had on British international schools in your area?
So in answer to your question about an overview of the impact of COVID closures in the region, I think it's fair to say that the impact has been profound. In particular, it's the prolonged nature of closure and the uncertainty of future plans that I think we're finding hardest to manage and prepare for. We're all facing significant challenges, some much worse than others, but it would be fair to say that it hasn't been easy for anyone. Regional school closure began in early March, and no schools that I'm aware of have been able to open since then. It was impossible to forecast the length of closure at the time, but we did have the benefit of experiences in Asia to draw from, and we realised that the challenges ahead would likely be substantial and prolonged. My impressions are that schools who successfully adapted to the online environment relied upon the foundation of what was already in place in schools. Almost all BSME schools already had an established VLE or LMS. Ours was underutilised, but it was there and staff had reasonable confidence in using it. It's fair to say that they're experts now. In terms of government guidance, speaking on behalf of BSME schools, which represents 144 schools in 9 diverse countries, I am cautious to generalise, but the challenges have ranged across the spectrum from over-regulation to minimal direction. I think that schools have done a remarkable job negotiating uncertainty, forming short-term and long-range plans with sufficient flexibility to respond to capricious need. I anticipate little respite for schools and school leaders. I think many face challenges of staff who are unable to leave the country. Supporting staff wellbeing through summer will be a continuing challenge, and then there is the great uncertainty of what happens come August with the return of staff and arrival of new staff to countries whose borders are currently closed. There is absolutely nothing to suggest that the start of the new academic year will bring respite. We're all planning for the scenarios of full campus closure, phased opening, blended learning, normal start, etc., recognising that flexibility and resilience are essential skills for school leaders for the months ahead.
So Mark, just shifting the focus slightly onto fee adjustments and parental responses. Mark, the media in the Middle East has given lots of attention to parents' demands for fee reductions because of campus closures. In BSME's survey to member schools, approximately 44% of schools indicated that they had offered no reduction in school fees. How are parents responding to this?
Hi, Will, and hi, everybody. I think the first thing to say is that we've all got to be careful, parents, teachers, school leaders, external. We've got to be careful and conscious not to judge schools upon their decision to discount or not discount. Each school has its own business model. All have to survive this period, and all are expected to survive ready to start up and running in September. So they have ongoing running costs. Our teachers are still working, so we need fees. So a number of schools have discounted. We're one of them. I think the parents' responses have been very mixed. We've had people who are delighted and who have really struggled and are delighted with it. We've got people who want more discounts, and I think the biggest demand there has been for the younger years, nursery reception, where the distance learning has been a lot more hands-on for parents. And we've also had parents who have paid the full amount even after discount has been offered. And we've got some who have donated money to the school to help parents who are really struggling. So I don't think there's one consistent response from parents. I think it's really mixed. And that just goes to show how everybody has been impacted very differently in this whole circumstance.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Continuing on this theme, but looking outside of the Middle East, Sam, you have members of your team in China and Southeast Asia, two other major sub-regions for international schools. How are international schools beyond the Middle East responding to parent demands and expectations? Are many of them adjusting their fees or offerings for next academic year to ensure enrolment levels?
Hi, Will, can you hear me?
We can hear you well, Sam, yeah. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, so thanks, Will. So firstly, it's great to be joining you all today. The curve flattened sufficiently long ago for some countries in Asia to reopen schools. Some governments, such as Indonesia and Cambodia, are taking a more cautious approach, but thus far we see international schools in China, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, and many more operating on campus in some form once again. Opening campus facilities before the summer break has been a real positive, as this has offered parents a glimpse of normality prior to an extended break. Some schools are using new freedoms as opportunities to offer schools, summer schools with individualized programs, and this is often used to compensate for lost time. A note here to consider is that schools in China have actually been banned from offering summer schools. Schools we've been speaking to in the region have, on the whole, been able to adapt to online learning quickly. Schools have been communicating regularly with parents and have been collecting a large amount of parent feedback on expectations surrounding learning, i.e. asynchronous or synchronous, project-based, and so on. As is the case in the Middle East, and as Mark just mentioned, schools in Asia have been broaching the subject of fee reductions in a number of different ways, really. There are those that have decided against fee reductions. Some have decided to reduce fees either for the last term of this academic year or for the first term of 2020-21. Other schools are reducing fees dependent on financial circumstances, and some schools offered the opportunity for students to leave in the summer term with a guaranteed space in the autumn term, but without discount. So heads suggested thus far that parents are appearing more savvy when enrolling as well, asking about school processes and crisis management strategies, including fees, should a second wave hit, of course. To answer your question, Will, parental demands are largely being met, but there is no hard and fast rule. It depends on the community of the school and the manner in which schools have transitioned thus far. but averagely we've seen fee reductions where relevant anywhere from 10 to 30%.
Thank you very much, Sam. It's interesting to hear more about the adaptability shown by the schools in your region with regard to this. We've got a question for Nicola now. Nicola, can I just test to see if you can hear me?
When BSME made the difficult decision to cancel the 2020 annual conference and the Under 11 large games, the executive reviewed experience and expertise within the committee to manage the resulting challenges. I've been in the region for 16 years and have more experience in crisis management than my humble teaching career ever prepared me for. I don't think the region is more adept to managing the COVID challenge than other parts of the world, but I will boldly say that BSME schools, as properly accredited BSO schools, had the advantage of understanding and embracing standards with robust policies in place and senior leaders with the capacity to adapt successfully to various challenges. Most, if not all, BSME schools had a foundational VLE or LMS, as I've already said, and they were able to lean upon that when schools closed and we moved learning online. Again, we benefited from the wisdom of insight into what was working well and what wasn't working well in the East, with lessons learned from those who were a month or so ahead of us in terms of response to the pandemic. For me in Egypt, we already had a staff evacuation procedure to follow in the event that we needed to use it. If nothing else, that was a comfort for staff. We also had well-established staff emergency phone tree and communication procedures in place, which have proven essential to staff wellbeing and information sharing since closure. Embassy connections were already in place and some understanding of what to expect or what not to expect from them, and host country government agencies. We were in good relations and sustaining good communication channels with them also. Having guided my school through the turbulence of Egypt's political troubles a decade ago, I was able to apply lessons learned then to now, such as the crucial importance of staying connected and communicative with staff and other stakeholders. That said, I don't think anything could really have prepared us for the events as they unfolded these past 4 months and the global scale of it.
So Mark, the government in the UAE has been inspecting schools to determine if online learning excuse me, has been effective during campus closures, with the intention of this informing requirements for learning models into the next academic year. Can you expand on this at all for us?
Yeah, of course, Will. As a school head, you want to be assured of what you're doing, and let's not forget this was completely new for many of us. So the UAE government chose to do well, it's not an inspection, it's an evaluation. I was involved in the initial discussions about how it worked, and it looked very heavy at first, but it wasn't when it came out. So we did ours about 7 days ago. We were given a full brief a few days before, plenty of notice of what was required in terms of documentation. It lasted 1 day, 5 hours. It was very much a light touch. 2 inspectors. We're a school of 3 to 18, nearly 2,000 students. So we had 2 evaluators, sorry, not inspectors. Light touch. They visited lessons online if they were live, or they looked at pre-recorded that we put in a store archive. We had a discussion about safeguarding, as in a stranger entering a lesson. So they had particular school codes so they could get invites, so we knew who it was. The 2 focus points were on the academic delivery and the well-being. And when I talk about well-being, the well-being of students and staff as well, which was really useful. The feedback on the day was very limited, and they said this at the beginning. It's not like an inspection where at the end of the day you get a form of a verbal report. It was very much that they'd just done their work and completed everything, and a report follows. We're waiting for our report probably about 10 days after. I must say I was initially very concerned because of the pressures on staff, but the template that was used was very useful, and I actually think that could be taken and used by schools to evaluate themselves if this continues, or as many suspect next year, there may be a bit of a hybrid of being in school and then being out of school at certain times. So for the online quality, I've actually found it really useful, and I think part of it was the approach of the evaluators, that it was light touch and to be supportive.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. So just taking that question there of a hybrid strategy and the schools looking at reopening, Sam, your field-based team at ISC Research has been gathering intelligence from many international schools, including those in parts of Asia that were first to reopen. Can you tell us about some of the best practice occurring to prepare those schools for a safe reopening?
Yeah, so using China as my example, the reopening of schools began in phases. As children returned, their first day was focused on special lessons about hygiene practices and preventative measures. In preparation for reopening, all staff took part in extensive training to ensure social distancing requirements. Schools had to gain permission from their local education bureau to open. Individual schools' reopening plans had to be agreed with their local education, health and food safety authorities. So there was plenty going on there. And these bodies carried out on-site inspections of each school's readiness to reopen and provided strict requirements as well. So those requirements for schools included the following. So systems limiting campus access, processes to manage large group gatherings, particularly around dining and assemblies, procedures for health checks during the school day, i.e. health and temperature monitoring of pupil, staff and contractors, and that's usually 3 times daily. Requirements also included heightened cleaning and sanitizing regimes, ensuring sufficient stocks of PPE, restrictions on students having to quarantine for 2 weeks should they travel outside of their province, so quite restrictive there. Producing clear messaging and literature about health and safety measures throughout the school, and finally to establish new procedures for student transportation to and from the school campus. So some of the schools we've spoken to who are larger in size have been quite fortunate in being able to get 100% of their cohort back at the same time. But those with tighter space constraints have needed to stagger reintroducing students to the site. Schools we would suggest with a larger campus versus student body, finding the process easier to manage. Many of these practices have been commonplace throughout schools opening in Asia Pacific. And when speaking with regional heads across the continent, we're also hearing of schools implementing initial guidelines such as changing their school hours, alternating weeks of face-to-face and remote instruction, conducting assemblies via video, allowing no face-to-face meetings, making sure equipment is wiped down thoroughly following every single lesson, enforcing strict guidelines of movement within schools, making sure teachers are off campus unless they're teaching, blocking access within buildings between kindergarten, primary and secondary, strictly banning all external contractors and parents from site in certain circumstances, and making sure teachers wear face shields whilst teaching, which we've heard have been 3D printed in some instances in the more industrious campuses, which is great to hear. With countries in Asia being at the forefront of progression back to a level of normality, the world is taking note, of course, of those who are navigating the pitfalls initially. And China's already had to take steps back, as many of you will have already been reading about with Beijing, due to another minor outbreak. So all schools in Beijing are now closed, and that's with no date yet published for them to reopen. So almost certainly they won't be opening before the end of this. Well, they won't be opening before the end of this academic year. I can say that for sure. But there's a lot of talk about them not being open at the beginning of next academic year as well, which is putting some uncertainty into the picture in China. And I imagine schools will take note of this and adopt a cautious approach for reopening globally. So there's certainly lots going on, Will.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And we've spoken quite a bit about students there and the measures that schools are taking to ensure the students can return. Just on staffing, as we prepare for the new year, staffing is of great concern to many school leaders for a variety of reasons. And Sam, I know you and your research team are hearing about some of the challenges of international schools and the challenges they face regarding staffing. Can you highlight some of the most common issues that you and your team are coming across in this area?
Yeah, absolutely, Will. So The big one for China is because school closures happened during the Chinese New Year, many teachers were overseas and thus haven't been able to get back into China. And these teachers have been working remotely and often without access to quality resources, and rather unenviably from different time zones, such as the UK. And some stranded teachers are also having to face the new challenge of teaching students who are now back on the school campus, where schools have reopened, of course. Schools in China are concerned that the work permits for these teachers will expire before they get back into country as well. And I'm aware that, having spoken to a couple of head teachers, that the British Chamber is trying to support schools here. For most schools in the rest of East and Southeast Asia, the major concern is surrounding how they will get their new teachers work visas, work permits, residency status, and then settle before the new academic year starts. We're aware some countries have blocked new working visas altogether for a large part of 2020, which is, of course, a real problem, as I'm sure you're all aware. Schools are being forced in extreme circumstances as well, often where student numbers have dropped, to rescind teacher contracts and or to look to hire from the local market. And we can see an increase in the frequency of job adverts on well-known sites recruiting for temp teachers and looking for applicants already in country. And specifically, we've seen that on sites like TES for within China. Some schools have mentioned that they've prepared another draft whole school timetable to cope with fewer teachers. And also there's uncertainty as to whether new teachers will have to do a 14-day quarantine or self-isolation on arrival, which I'm sure you can appreciate is slightly less than desirable for new teachers heading to a new country. If we're looking at opportunities though, and positives, from speaking with heads, teachers teachers seem largely keen to take up their posts overseas, even with what's been going on with COVID-19. And reports suggest, as a result of COVID-19, this year we'll see fewer teachers leave the profession, as education is seen as a secure, stable industry. And there is a general feeling that, having been thrown into the deep end with online learning, teachers may well have picked up a newfound confidence with their use of tech platforms, and thus the likelihood of teachers continuing to use tech in the classroom post-COVID-19 is of course expected, and that's something for suppliers to keep a close eye on.
Thank you very much, Sam. And Mark, just taking a closer look at the UAE, what are you hearing in the UAE about staff challenges and how schools are responding?
Yeah, thanks, Ron, and thanks, Sam. I think I'm just going to build on a number of things that Sam's spoken about, but I do want to start with an analogy, and it's not linked to the Middle East, it's the teaching profession. This COVID-19 pandemic hit us, and pretty much over a weekend or a week or maximum of 2 weeks, we had to completely change how we operate. And the analogy I use, and I've used it a few times with parents when they're saying we're not getting the same service, for example. The best thing I can say is imagine a fixed wing pilot on an Airbus A380, and they've been trained, they've gone through their training, they're regularly flying for whatever airline, and then over the weekend they're being asked to switch to fly a helicopter. It's the same principles of flight, but the skills are very different, and that's basically what our teachers have been asked to do. So I think it's absolutely amazing how staff have coped. The challenges, fear for jobs. There's a number of schools having to really look, well, all schools having to look at their budgets and tighten. So a fear for jobs and security, a fear for pay cuts, a fear for getting new contracts. So that's definitely something, a challenge for staff. There are some, Sam said that many people see it as a stable profession, but there are some who are overseas who say, actually, due to the uncertainty globally, we're missing our family back home in our base and are looking to go sooner than they would have normally planned. New staff are worried about whether they can get into the country, similar to what Sam said. So there's that concern. We've got vulnerable and single staff who are lonely, so their well-being is under pressure. But then you've also got teachers who have young children of their own and are having to work school hours, but also educate and support the distance learning for their children. So I think everybody has challenges to a certain extent. How are schools responding? They're reaching out regularly to staff. I'm seeing regular communication. As chair of BSME, I'm hearing some great stories where schools have been really innovative to try and support staff. Regular communication has been a key success for schools, and staff feel, we did a staff survey and they said regular communication, let them know that they're still very much part of the school and what's going on is reassuring. There's been social activities from schools such as quizzes, shout outs for people who have maybe had an engagement or an anniversary or birthday, etc. Helped by, I know a number of leadership teams have helped by managing workloads. I think some people have been absolutely swamped because we don't have the usual bells at the beginning and start of a lesson. So the lesson drifts in terms of students are communicating all the time and staff feel under pressure to continually reply. So we've put parameters around the hours that staff can be communicated. I think a real collegiate approach has come out. A bit like distance makes the heart grow fonder. I've seen that. So I think for me, it's the communication has helped all of this. And what we've tried to do, and I know a number of schools have done this, the communications had to be thorough, regular, inclusive, and most of all, honest. So when we've had a challenge, we've raised it with the staff so they're not caught blindside. They don't have those usual interactions in the corridor. They hear it up front. Don't miss out on things. And that's how I think schools, I'm talking about ours, but I think schools in general have done that and really excel to try and support their staff's well-being.
Thank you, Mark. That's definitely a valuable insight to the staffing side of things. And at the beginning there, you mentioned budgets and pay cuts. And I'm just thinking, if we flip that and look at revenues and admissions and enrolment, how do you think student enrolment throughout international schools in the UAE will be impacted next academic year because of the impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think for a number of schools, they'll be fearful that the numbers could be down. I know, I'm saying particularly the UAE, I can't speak with expertise from elsewhere, but a number of our schools in the UAE have large contingents from Etihad Airlines and Emirates, and they've had massive cuts of some sort. So I think their student population from big companies where they've had cuts will go down. Some families feel that being isolated during this time, they've felt alone and want to return to their home country. So even if jobs are secure, they want to go back just to be with their loved ones in their family in their home country. I think a big challenge that we're going to be facing, and this is going to be really interesting, I think, for schools across the globe that haven't started back yet. So in the UAE, we haven't, and we're going to be starting back in September, hopefully. If a student is coming into our school and we have to offer a hybrid program of some lessons inside the school, some outside, or distance learning, and their home country is fully back in operation, I think people will possibly leave and say, I can get a full education in my home country, and maybe the mother and father split so that the working employee stays overseas, almost on the bachelor lifestyle, and the family return to the home. And I think that's a big fear. And I think numbers will be down, maybe not as down as some people think, but I think the other challenge on admissions is whether people are able to pay. So in the UAE, quite often we don't get our fees on day one, but the students are in. So I think there could be quite a bit of challenges with that. However, I think there's also opportunities. I think our online provision in terms of information to parents, and I know a number of schools have done online tours, online open days. I think the parents will be far more informed using, again, as Sam said, the tech. I think schools have used that not just in the classroom, but also of how to promote themselves. And I also think there'll be schools that have traditionally been very difficult to get into, highly oversubscribed. If they've got vacancies, for some parents, that could be an opportunity to get into these schools where they may not have been able to in the past. So I think there are some opportunities out of admissions dropping, but I think that from a school perspective, it is a big concern.
Sure, thank you, Mark. It's interesting to hear highlighting the opportunities there. And just thinking about education suppliers, we'll have a number of education suppliers listening to this webinar today. Do you have any sense of how resource expenditure or focus of resourcing priorities is changing in the schools within the UAE and directly because of the impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, I think budgets are obviously much tighter and far more scrutinised in the past. Heads and business managers or bursars or whatever the financial managers or whatever the terminology is in your school, they've created a budget. It's been approved by the owner, the board, or whatever the structure is, and you operate that budget. We're going to be looking at reforecasting monthly because I think the picture is going to change so quickly. I do want to, at this point though, say that a big thank you to the BSME partners, as they've offered amazing support for our schools across a range of areas, and I think that's a real strength of that collegiate approach. So I think there'll be more investment in IT, both in terms of tech and training, but also safety provisions such as the scanners. That's they don't come cheap. I think CPD will be revisited. I think a number of courses where traditionally you have visited a conference centre or another school, they may be done online. So again, I think that the CPD budgets will have to reflect that, but also where there may be a saving on travel costs, there may be an investment in tech to facilitate that. I think the safety COVID compliant is going to be a huge investment because we all want to get our students back in, and if that means making sure it's safe, then that's what we've got to do. So for me, the whole finance picture is quite worrying, but it needs to be managed carefully. And I think if it's managed carefully with regular visits to it, I think what people are focusing their investments on in the past may be different moving forward.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. Sam, your feedback on the wider international schools market has been really valuable today, as there's clearly a focus on the Middle East with the theme of the webinar. So thank you for this contribution. How can international schools listening to this access more of the information you've shared to guide their own planning?
So I'm sure almost everyone here has seen at least a few good webinars broaching these subjects, and of course much more associated with COVID-19 as well. Many of the associations, such as Mark's already mentioned, BSME, have been offering great insight into the current impacts. Conference brands such as Informa as well have been offering quality insights too. I'm aware that individual software providers have been offering valuable online training free of charge as well. We as an organisation have tried to use our position within the market as an intelligence and research-based company to relay the many key challenges and opportunities facing international schools and suppliers during this uncertain period. We've developed an ISC Research white paper focusing on the historical impact of previous crises on international schools, and this is available for free for suppliers, investors and schools on our website. We've written a future schools report looking at the opportunities and challenges around admissions, marketing and recruitment. We've been sharing weekly updates per country on the current situation and the impact on our market, available on our website too. And we also have a number of coronavirus related pre-recorded webinars and blogs free to access. You can get in touch with any of the team who will be happy to point you in the right direction to access any of these. As a company, ISC Research also has a range of products and services to support international school leaders with business planning. And these are such as our ISC positioning service and our benchmarking reports, which many of you will be aware of already, to help you know where you stand within the current market and climate. For education suppliers, much of our research is absolutely relevant to you too. We have supplier reports which share excellent intelligence on the market. We also have our data portal, which offers a unique view of international schools. And again, to suppliers, get in touch for further information here.
Thank you very much, Sam.
Yes, I think we will follow the lead of the successes learned from our friends in Asia, as Sam has just referenced. I think we all realise that a full return of students come September is unlikely. 58% of BSME schools who responded to our recent survey anticipate a phased return of students and have an array of plans ready for what that will look like. Health checks and cleaning processes have all been increased substantially by all. 92% of respondents to the survey said that protective face covering will be a requirement by all on campus. And I think that percentage will rise as we move closer to September and realise that the coronavirus is highly unlikely to have gone away by then. Schools are reviewing campus accessibility by people who are not essential to day-to-day business, and that includes parents. Policies regarding equipment handling, shared supplies in early years and Key Stage 1, PE equipment, etc. are being developed by most schools. Various measures are being taken to reduce student contact across campus, abandonment of live assemblies and gatherings, cancellation of special events, split breaks to reduce yard numbers, etc. 83% of BSME schools are abandoning their extracurricular activity program for at least term 1, including trips and before and after school activities. The emphasis is on keeping students in a bubble when they're on campus, so even looking at contact and interaction between class groups is something that schools are seeking to restrict. Obviously, policy review of what to happen in the event of a positive case amongst student or staff community is also another thing that schools are considering. I've referenced health and cleaning procedures, but connections with local medical providers to ensure that in the event of recognising a student or staff member presenting with symptoms and what the school's response will be to that immediately is something that all schools are giving thought to. School calendar review and the subsequent cancellation of events is motivated by both the need to reduce opportunity for interaction as well as the priority we will have to recover gaps in learning. The essential business of schools in term 1 and throughout next year will be on the taught curriculum. 85% of BSME schools are implementing new strategies to assess and address learning gaps resulting from campus closures. There are various providers and suppliers in the industry to offering some wonderful packages to support that. The same percentage are implementing new strategies to support the well-being of students and staff, as I think we all recognise that the emotional toll of COVID closures on all members of the school community is extensive, and schools have a responsibility to lead or at least support initiatives to ensure that all members of the school community are okay. Regional challenges will include starting the academic year in 40-degree heat when we know that outdoor space is healthier than indoor space from the perspective of virus control. We will have to give due consideration to air filtration and cooling systems in terms of health and safety. More so in the Middle East than other regions is the reliance our communities have on school transportation services. Schools will have to consider a social distancing protocol that will inevitably compromise capacity on buses. Managing that in consultation with parents is another challenge. And there are other financial implications to lose sleep contemplating as well. Governments in the region are likely to dictate tight parameters regarding fee increase, fee freeze, and perhaps fee compensation. There's also student roll and the return or otherwise of international families to their expatriate designations is unlikely to be what it was prior to COVID, and so many schools with an international clientele are having to give careful consideration to what that might look like for their school community. There is plenty to think about, and again, flexibility and resilience will be critical. There is an interesting paper on the BSME website, there is a COVID file, it's called The Roadmap to Reopening, which has been drafted by BSME UK consultant John Bocking, and I do recommend that those listening to this webinar take a look at that document just as a starting place for contemplation about their school's context and what might be relevant for them. How well schools have been managed through the second half of this year is already a prominent theme of social media chatter amongst teachers and school review contributors. That will affect schools positively or negatively. There are plenty of comparisons being made. Two common threads of those conversations are teachers' need for financial security and their need for accurate communication. Will contracts be honoured? Will salaries be affected if school closure continues? And how effective have school leaders been in providing accurate information and substantiated assurances? COVID might reduce the number of teachers choosing to embark on an international career and wishing to stay closer to home, but then home hasn't necessarily managed the COVID crisis well in terms of infection control or school-related policies, so that may encourage more to explore offshore opportunities. Travel restrictions and the challenges of getting home to family may increase the numbers of seasoned international teachers who decide that this is the reason they need to permanently repatriate. That said, I know that retention rates have benefited significantly from present circumstances at my school and many others, perhaps a temporary response to present reality rather than anything to forecast future trends upon. I do think it is too early to tell. Recruitment season will throw at us what it will, but we may be more ready for that uncertainty than elsewhere because the Middle East has been harder to market over the last decade or so. School heads in this region are expert promoters in a competitive field. That, coupled with the evident decline in China's appeal, may write a narrative that is different to previous years, but we'll just simply have to wait and see. I do regard the Middle East as being ahead of the game with regards to innovative recruitment and staffing practices. And perhaps this is where historical regional instability might have prepared us. Most of us staff our schools with contingency plans in mind. Additionally, BSO accreditation enables BSME schools the opportunity to recruit and support NQTs, and the region has been successfully supporting teacher training pathways for many years. The ability to grow our own teachers with legitimate training and the qualifications accredited qualifications is one way we have responded to the global teacher shortage, and that will most certainly continue. We have a dedicated executive working closely with Olivia and the head office team. Executive members are all full-time heads of school in the region, so the challenges are well known. The executive, along with BSME country representatives and the networks within countries, has facilitated extensive support. In Egypt, for example, BSME heads are in frequent contact with conversations almost daily about government policy, embassy support, repatriation flights, etc., as well as light-hearted banter to keep us sane through the inevitable moments of darkness. We meet weekly on Zoom, and whilst respecting the different nature of our schools and the unique circumstances that contextualise each, we do share experiences and insight for the greater good of ourselves and our schools, and it's been really valuable to have that connectedness with the Egypt BSME Schools network. Webinars such as this one have provided another way for BSME member schools to feel supported and to continue to learn through closure. The Early Years Network is one example of a successful BSME initiative, soon to be replicated with the introduction of a number of other subject specialist networks in September. All wonderful opportunities to ensure collaboration over common concerns and to share good practice. I think the strength of BSME is that its unwavering purpose to strengthen schools and serve students. And by reinforcing the strength of connections and relationships within our BSME community, we're providing support and advisory to one another. I know that that's been invaluable to me through the past 4 months, and I'm relying on that going forward. My advice is simple. I think what we all need to do is take stock of the massive accomplishments achieved in recent months. I think our tendency as human beings and as educators is to lament the things that we could have done better or to chastise the opportunities that we missed. But my advice is to be kind to yourself. The journey is not yet complete, and whilst summer will provide some important time for thinking and strategizing, it must also provide time for self-indulgence so that we ourselves are emotionally ready for whatever lies ahead. Beyond that, I've said it already, whatever plans you conceptualise, ensure that they are sufficiently flexible and resilient to withstand unanticipated change. Don't sweat the small stuff, and by that I mean don't exhaust energy embroiled in the minutiae until you are certain of your reality, and then respond to that reality. Keep it simple, keep stakeholders informed, even if it is to contradict decisions previously announced. They get that we are negotiating uncharted waters. We continue to see fine examples of how global leaders aren't getting it right, so we'll be forgiven if we don't have all the right answers all of the time. and keep connected with each other through BSME networks or whatever mechanism you have to support you and access some light relief. School leadership, especially through challenge, does not have to be a lonely road to travel.
So Mark, can I just invite you to share any final thoughts that you might have at the moment?
Yeah, before I do, Will, I've been looking through the questions, and obviously we said we're not going to answer them, so I won't, but I'm happy to, some of them being quite specific to the UAE, so if you want to reach out to me with those questions, I'm happy to put some things together so that anyone on this can get something in writing from us of innovative ways we've supported staff. There's some questions on budgeting, how we're looking at that. So happy to answer any of those if you're okay with that.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Mark.
Okay. No problem. Okay, so final thoughts really from me. Speaking from the heart, I think it's been a huge struggle for many people, and I'm talking about the schools here, not the global situation, but I think schools, it's been a real struggle, and we talk about growth mindset and getting our students to work outside their comfort zone. I think as a school, I'm talking schools in general, that has been the case for the school itself as well. But at a time of adversity, I genuinely believe that we see real strength, and this is no exception. We're working on shifting sands, and I'm not just talking about the desert in the Middle East. It literally is shifting sands. Things are changing, directives are changing, literally day by day across the globe in schools. But as a school leader and chair of the BSME, I've seen some of the greatest leadership, innovation, care and resilience from leaders and teachers that I've ever seen in my 30 years as an educator and 20 as a school leader. It is absolutely unbelievable. The care, the passion, and just the real thought that goes into everything to say we've got to look after these children. And it makes me very proud of education. It makes me proud of how we've coped. And really, I can't wait to get back to the lovely normal that we will never ever take for granted again, and it cannot come soon enough. But what we've got to do in between is make sure we're ready for that return, which I don't think is going to be straightforward. I don't think it's going to be straightforward physically as a school. I think it's not going to be straightforward emotionally. There's talk about, oh, parents can't wait to get their kids back in school, but I think there'll be a number who will be very challenged to come back, be nervous. And if you think of children over a summer period, 6 weeks, how many of them change physically as they go through adolescence. We've been away for 6 months. I think there's going to be some real challenges for students coming back in emotionally and their well-being. So the one thing I'm sure of, though, is that all of the schools will cope, because they've coped through this, and they'll do all they can for their students. So for me, I just want to wish everybody all the very best at getting back, and hopefully it will happen for all of us very soon.
Thanks very much, Mark. And I know all of us at ISC will echo that very much also. So just to finish up here from our perspective, if you want to know more about the impact of coronavirus on the wider international schools market, ISC Research is always sharing news and intelligence in various ways. Here are some links on the screen that might be of help to you. Do look out for our latest blogs, which are sharing some exceptional details through the pandemic from our field-based research consultants, as well as good practice shared by schools. And there are some valuable features in the recent June and April issues of the International School Leader magazine regarding how schools have been responding to the impact of COVID-19 and how they have prepared for reopening. You can find all past issues of the International School Leader magazine on its website. And of course, if you need any data or information about the market specific to your needs as a school or as a business organisation, do get in touch with us. That just leaves me to say thank you to Mark, Nicola and Sam for sharing such valuable advice today. Thanks to everybody for listening in. If you've submitted a question, we will aim to respond to all questions either directly or via a blog, which will be posted on ISC Research blog page, and we'll definitely have Mark's input on those for the UAE specific questions. You can also email me directly or through LinkedIn. We'd be very, very glad to connect. So thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.